manager here. And tonight we have a special presentation by Professor Harold Waller, who is a professor of political science at McGill University. His research interests include U.S. politics and public policy, Jewish political studies, and Israeli politics. He's a CIJR academic fellow and a regular contributor to our Isranet daily, to our IsraFacts magazine, our quarterly magazine. He has a new book out, which was just released very recently.
I just got it today.
Yeah.
My first copy. Yeah.
It's co-authored with Brent Sasley, is that the right name? Yeah. And it's called Politics in Israel, Governing a Complex Society, published by Oxford University Press. And tonight he will be speaking about Israel, Zionism, and state from the Balfour Declaration to the Six-Day War. So thank you very much, and Professor Harold Waller.
First of all, I apologize for the shameless self-promotion, but the book actually was published last week, and I got my first copy today, so you were the first guys to see it, and I'll be happy to pass it around. It's quite a bit different from what I'm talking about today, because this series is really about Israel and its relations with the world and with the Arab states and the Palestinians, whereas the book is about Israeli domestic politics. But if you're interested in Israel domestic politics, I think it's an excellent source and very comprehensive. So we're going to try to cover 50 critical years of Israel prehistory and post-48 history in about an hour, which allows us about a minute per year, which is hardly adequate. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk without questions for about an hour, and then I'll be happy to take all your questions. But I find that if we have questions along the way, it tends to make things a little bit more difficult to manage the time. You should all have copies of these maps. There are plenty of copies available, and I'll be referring to them from time to time. I'm going to start with 1917, which was a very important year in the history of Israel. In previous seminars, you've heard about Jewish history, about founding of the Zionist movement. So what happened in 1917? Of course, that was in the middle of World War I. The British were anxious to maintain the support of world Jewry, which they thought was important, perhaps because they bought into some notions about Jewish power, I don't know. Russia was in crisis. They just had the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks took over, and Jews were important in Russia, and perhaps the British thought that this would help to keep the Russians in the war. Whatever the motivation, the work of the Zionist organization, particularly Chaim Weizmann, was instrumental in convincing the British government to issue this declaration, which came out of the cabinet. I'm going to read it, it's not very long, and then make a couple of points. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. So several comments here. First of all, they mentioned Palestine. Palestine was a name given by the Romans to Judea after they defeated the revolt of Bar Kokhba in the year 135. They deliberately wanted to obliterate the Jewish connection to the land, and so they gave it a name derived from the Palestinians, not the Philistines. And that's where the idea of Palestine came from. The name was not used after the Romans left the area, but it was revived in 1917 by the British when they conquered the area as part of their war effort against the Ottoman Empire, which had controlled what came to be called Palestine from about 1517 until 1917, about 400 years. So the British called it Palestine, and they said that they wanted to establish a Jewish national home for the Jewish people. Important, they didn't talk about a state, but they did talk about a national home, which means that they conceptualized the Jews as a nation, as a people. And this is critical to understanding what has developed with regard to Israel. They also say that nothing should be done to prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. Well, who are the existing non-Jewish communities? Arabs. And they're talking about the civil and religious rights of those Arabs. They don't talk about national rights of the Arabs. The purpose of the mandate, well, the purpose of the Balfour Declaration, later the mandate, was to establish a Jewish national home, not an Arab national home. And the civil and religious rights of the Arabs were to be respected, but not any national rights. So this is an important point to bear in mind, and we'll see later how it comes in. And they also don't want to prejudice the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. There are many Jews, including leading British Jews, including some in the cabinet, who were anti-Zionists because they felt that if there were a Jewish national home, there would be people in Britain or in France or in Germany who would say, okay, you've got a national home, go. That's the end of the Jewish problem. These people said, we're British, we're French, we're German, we expect to remain here, and therefore we don't support Zionism. Okay, so that's the Balfour Declaration, and that was welcomed by the Zionists as a legitimation of the Zionist goal of establishing, reestablishing Jewish national presence in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, which was the traditional Jewish name for this territory. Okay, what happened next? After the end of World War I, there was a peace conference in 1919, and there were four empires that were broken up as a result of World War I. The Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian. All these empires were broken up as a result of World War I. With the breakup of the Ottoman Empire and these other empires, there was a question of what do you do with the territories that had been held by these empires? Austria-Hungary controlled Romania, controlled parts of Yugoslavia, parts of what maybe was later Russia, whatever. So the question is, what do you do with these territories? And one of the principles of the peace conference, which was articulated first by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, was that peoples, national groups, should be entitled to self-determination. And so various national groups lined up at the peace conference to try to persuade the people who were running the conference, essentially the victorious allies, to support their goal for national self-determination. And the Jews were among those who lined up, represented by the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann in particular. The peace conference was sympathetic to the Jewish claims, and they agreed to basically further the goals of the mandate through the peace settlement. And there were negotiations that led to, there was a San Remo conference in 1920, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Sèvres, also in 1920, and then there was the Lausanne Treaty in 1924, dealing with the disposition of the former Ottoman territories in the Middle East. And those territories had been Arabia, what came to be called Palestine, Greater Syria, which included Lebanon, and Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. And so the decision of the peacemakers was that the peoples of these areas were not yet ready for self-determination. And what the Allied powers would do, which were essentially Britain and France in this case, they would be given trusteeships over these territories to administer until the peoples were ready for statehood. Arabia was not included in this plan because the Ibn Saud had begun to take over, and the British and French were really not able to exercise authority there. There are implications because the guy who had worked with the British in during the war to fight against the Turks in Arabia, and the Hejaz, as it was called, was named Sharif. He was the Sharif of Mecca, and his name was Hussein. He was the guardian of the holy places of the Muslims in Mecca and Medina. He was forced out of Arabia by Saud, and basically he asked the British government to find a place where he could be a big shot, or at least his sons could be big shots. We'll come back to that in a few moments. So the three trusteeships, which the League of Nations called mandates, and the League of Nations granted the mandates and administered the mandates, or oversaw the mandates. They were administered by Britain and France. The three mandates were for Mesopotamia, which was given to Britain, Syria, which was given to France, which is why French is a major language in Syria and Lebanon, and Palestine, which was given to the British. Now let's take a look at the maps. So we see the map of 1881, which was basically an undifferentiated part of the Ottoman Empire. It was not really called Palestine. It had a name in the Turkish lexicon. If you look at 1919, we see the mandate of Palestine. This map is a little bit inaccurate because there was no country called Jordan at the time. But basically, what happened here is that the contemplated Jewish national home was all of what's labeled as Palestine on the map of 1919, and what's called Jordan was really Transjordan, which was included in the Palestine Mandate. In other words, it was under the authority of the British, but the British had brought in one of the sons of Sharif Hussein, Abdullah, and put him on the throne in Amman. They created a kingdom of Transjordan for him, and they created another kingdom in Iraq for the other son, Faisal. These two sons were essentially the payoff for the support that Hussein had given during the war to the British. The payoff was his two sons would be given monarchies in Transjordan and in Iraq. So the mandate was approved by the League of Nations in 1922, and what is very important for those of us who deal with these issues is that the text of the mandate that was granted to Britain incorporated verbatim the text of the Balfour Declaration, which we just read. So the League of Nations, which represented the international community, was committed legally to establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine, and not any other nationality there, because that was the wording of the Balfour Declaration. Now, just before the mandate went into effect in 1922, the British colonial secretary, who happened to be a man named Winston Churchill, as part of his dealings with Abdullah, who was then put on the throne, said that the provisions of the mandate relating to the Jewish national home would not apply east of the Jordan River. So from the point of view of the Zionists, the area that was originally allocated to the Jewish national home was severely reduced, but still left all the territory from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. And that was the mandate. That was essentially Palestine as of the beginning of the mandate. And what happened then was that there was a lot of conflict in what was called Palestine during the 25 years during which the mandate was in effect. And so I'm going to spend some time on the mandate period, which I divide into 4 parts chronologically. First of all, 1920 to 29. The British military was in control from 1917 till 1922 when a civil administration took over. The British appointed Herbert Samuel as the governor of Palestine. He governed under the directions of the Colonial Office in London. There was no directly elected government in Mandatory Palestine. The government of Palestine was purely administrative. So the policies were made in London and executed by Samuel and the administration in Palestine on the ground. As early as 1920, what we call intercommunal conflict emerged, Arabs versus Jews, and it was a harbinger of things to come because the entire mandate period was characterized by this intercommunal conflict, which was sometimes violent, resulted in deaths and injuries, but it was indicative of the inability of the two communities, the Arab and Jewish communities, to live together. In fact, they didn't live together. They lived within Palestine, but they didn't live together. The Jewish community was separate from the Arab community geographically, in terms of residential patterns. The Arabs had their towns and villages, which had existed for a long time. The Jews were in a few holy cities, mainly religious Jews, namely Hebron, Jerusalem, Tiberias, and Tzfat. But the Jews who came to Palestine in the various waves of immigration, the Aliyot, starting in 1882, largely created new communities. They were towns such as Rishon LeZion or Rehovot or Petach Tikva, or they were kibbutzim in various parts of the country, but they were not connected to, they may have been nearby, but they were not connected to Arab towns. So the Arabs lived here and the Jews lived there, except in the Haifa was also a mixed town, not for because it had religious significance, which it didn't, but because there were common interests in Haifa. So that was a mixed town. But most of the Jews and most of the Arabs lived separately from each other. They didn't work together. They didn't govern together. They didn't do business with each other. They weren't educated together. The Jews started their own schools, which were Hebrew language schools. The Arabs had Arabic schools. Basically, the two communities proceeded in parallel during the mandate period with very little interaction, and there was no structure in the mandatory government for interaction. So the Jews dealt with the mandatory government, and the Arabs dealt with the mandatory government, and they each had their own issues that they raised. So that was the situation during the 20s. The major issue that characterized the mandate period was immigration of Jews. The Zionists wanted to bring in Jews in maximum numbers. the Arabs were against immigration because the Arabs felt that the Jews had no business being in Palestine, and therefore they wanted to have as few Jews as possible. And they pressured the mandatory government along those lines because it was the mandatory government which controlled immigration. So the Jews constantly had to fight for immigration permits, and the Arabs were putting pressure on the British to resist immigration permits. Eventually, Jews came in, and just to give you some idea of populations, the British were very good at running the census. So they had frequent censuses, actually almost annually during the Mandate period. In 1922, which was their first census, there were almost 84,000 Jews out of a total population of 750,000. Gives you some idea of the numbers involved. And so the Arabs were much more numerous. In late 1920s, the population of Jews was about 150 to 170,000, reaching actually 165,000 at the end of the 20s, by which time the total population was close to 1 million. So one thing that is important to note is that while Jews had to fight for immigration permits because the Jews were coming in by ship, where the British could control it, the British were not controlling the land borders. And so there was considerable Arab immigration into Palestine during the Mandate period, illegally crossing the land borders and simply settling in various existing Arab communities. So, in 1922 there were almost 600,000 Muslims. By 1945 there were 1,100,000. That's not all from natural increase. Much of it is from immigration over the land borders. So this was a serious issue during the Mandate period, and basically the Arabs generally succeeded in getting the British to limit immigration. The Jews really wanted unlimited immigration, and the British would not permit it. The Jews organized themselves politically, and I won't go into details here, but the Jews were very well organized politically. The Jewish community of Palestine in the Mandate period was known as the Yishuv, which means those who are settled there. The Yishuv had institutions of various sorts, including governing institutions. But those institutions represented what we call in political science a voluntary polity. In other words, nobody was compelled to join because this was not a state that could compel people to do anything. But most of the Jews in the Yishuv, including for a while even the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, belonged to Yishuv institutions and participated in Yishuv elections. There were elections held regularly within the Jewish community of Palestine to elect people to governing bodies. And from these governing bodies, it was, a large body which didn't have much power, which would then elect a smaller body which had more power, and an even smaller body which had the most power. So the top of the structure of the Jews in the Yishuv was called the executive of the Va'ad Leumi, the National Council. And they were like a cabinet or a government, dealing with matters within the purview of the Yishuv. Then there was a Va'ad Leumi, a national council below them, and there was something farther down called Knesset Yisrael, the Assembly of Israel. And this was elected by the Jews of the Yishuv using the method of proportional representation, which was the method used in the Zionist congresses. And so the notion of proportional representation and voting for a party, a Zionist party, which represented an ideology, was a standard part of politics during the Yishuv period. And I deal with that in much greater detail in the book. Between 1929 and 39, the situation began to change dramatically for a variety of reasons. One is that there were attacks on the Jews in 1929, which resulted in massacres in places like Jerusalem and Hebron. Secondly, the Nazis came to power at the beginning of 1933, and the situation of German Jews in particular became much more tenuous, so many German Jews were eager to emigrate to go to Palestine. The irony is that between 1933 and 1939, about 2/3 of German Jews managed to emigrate. Many went elsewhere than Palestine, but a lot went to Palestine. However, the Jews in other countries in Europe did not appreciate the threat that Nazism posed, and therefore they didn't clamor for emigration the way the German Jews did. There's a further irony that Jabotinsky went around Eastern Europe in 37, 38, 39, sounding the alarm and telling the Jews what danger they were in and urging them to emigrate, and most didn't listen to him. Jabotinsky died in 1940 in America. From his point of view, his followers, his work was clearly unfinished. In any event, there was continuing tension over immigration during the 1930s, and finally the Arabs revolted. It's called the Great Arab Revolt, 1936 to 39. They wanted to get rid of the British, basically. The Jews backed the British, certainly preferable party in this case. But it was the British Army which had to subdue the Arabs, and the British didn't like doing that. But they eventually got things under control by 1939. In the meantime, there were two key developments. One was that because of the Arab Revolt, the British were getting tired of ruling Palestine even as a temporary measure, and so they appointed a royal commission called the Peel Commission, which came to Palestine in 1937, interviewed leading Jews, leading Arabs, and then made a recommendation to the British government as to what to do with the Palestine problem. And we have the fourth map, it's 1937, actually that's a different set of maps, that's why it's in color. It's not exactly the same. Okay, so look at, on your printed map in 1937, they came to the conclusion that the only way to deal with the problem in Palestine was to cut it into two parts, an Arab part and a Jewish part. And the proposal they made was very unfavorable to the Jews. The top part, the north, Galil, and the coastal strip, which are in white, were to become a Jewish state, whereas the dark shaded part, which is all of the Negev, plus much of the territory west of the Jordan River, was to become an Arab state, and the territory in the dark gray or black, whatever color it is here, was to be controlled by Britain, continuing as a mandated enclave, including Jerusalem and I think I'm not sure about Jaffa, but it was to be, an international part. So the Jewish state would have been cut into two parts and was a pretty small area anyway. Remember that the Zionists had started out expecting all of Palestine, and then they found it was only Palestine west of the Jordan River, and now they found it was this little bit in the north and the coastal strip. In any event, the Arabs rejected partition out of hand because their view was Palestine should become an Arab state based on one person, one vote, which obviously would have meant the Arabs would have been in total control. The Jews dithered about it. Some Jews were totally opposed for obvious reasons. It was a crappy deal. Others said, but the situation is desperate. If we have a state, we will control immigration, and we can let Jews from Europe who can come here come into Palestine. So they didn't give a definitive answer, but the Arab answer was definitive, and so the British dropped the idea of partition. And then they issued, in 1939, a white paper, notorious white paper from the Zionist point of view. Basically, they gave up on the Jewish national home. They said they were going to severely limit immigration for the next 5 years. This is the dawn of the worst crisis in Jewish history since the destruction of the Second Temple, and the British are reneging on their promises by sharply curtailing immigration to, I don't know, a token amount, really, in the tens of thousands per year. Furthermore, they committed themselves to, at some later date, essentially establishing an Arab state in Palestine. So the Jews, of course, totally rejected the white paper, and in Ben-Gurion's words, paraphrased because I don't remember the exact quote, "We will fight the white paper as if there were no war, and we will fight the Nazis as if there were no white paper." In fact, the priority of the Yishuv from 1939 to 1945 was fighting the Nazis, and they formed military units that fought with the British Army. Famously, Moshe Dayan was part of one of those units fighting in Syria, and he was wounded, and that's when he lost his eye. But many of the Zionists who fought with the British against the Nazis gained valuable military experience, which proved relevant later on. During the period of the war, 1939 to 1945, generally the Zionists supported the British effort because they understood that if the Nazis came into Palestine, which the Mufti was encouraging, that was the end of the Yishuv. And in fact, the Nazis were driving eastward across North Africa toward Egypt. And the Battle of El Alamein in 1942 was critical because that's when the British stopped the Nazi advance. Had they prevailed at El Alamein, I think they could have swept into Egypt, and from there it wasn't far into Palestine, and there was no real defensive line that could have been used by the British to defend Palestine against the Nazis. So the Yishuv was saved by the British victory, and the Zionists understood that very well.
Maybe I can just add that the fascists, the Italian fascists, actually bombarded Tel Aviv.
Okay.
Their planes was a pre-mission before the Nazis were to come and finish the work.
So Palestine was in danger during the war. In 1942, the Zionists, assessing everything that had gone on since 1920, organized a major conference in New York City. How they got everyone in New York City in 1942, I'm not sure, but I believe that Ben-Gurion was there and other leaders of the Yishuv and Zionist leadership that could get there from anywhere where they were, plus, of course, the American Zionist leadership. And at the Biltmore Hotel, where they held the conference, hence the name Biltmore Conference, they issued the Biltmore Program, which for the first time committed the Zionist movement to establishing a state. The ambiguity of a Jewish national home was set aside. This is where the decision was made that we are going for a state. And of course, it was understood this would happen after the Axis forces were defeated. After 1945, the war was over, and during the war, the right-wing paramilitary organizations had been fighting the British. The Haganah, which was labor-oriented, left-wing paramilitary organizations, did not generally fight the British during the war, but the Eitzel, which was the Irgun, the revisionist organization led after 1941 by Menachem Begin, and the Lehi, or the Stern Group, led by Yair Stern until he was killed in 1942, maybe, and then led later by a triumvirate which included Yitzhak Shamir, fought against the British. And in fact, the Lehi group organized the assassination of Lord Moyne, who was the British minister in Cairo in 1944, and he was a close confidant of Churchill. It could not have helped the relations between Churchill and the Zionists to have his man in Cairo assassinated by a Jewish group. Now, clearly the Lehi and the Eitzel were not subjected to the discipline of the Yishuv government, which was led by the labor Zionists, headed by Ben Gurion. They were political rivals, and they would not listen to the leadership of the Yishuv, which led the Eitzel group in 1946 to, on their own, bomb the British military headquarters in Jerusalem, which happened to be in the King David Hotel. There were a lot of deaths there. It's a very controversial event, which I don't want to get into. The Begin claimed that they had issued a warning. The British said there was no warning. Begin claimed it was a military target, but there were civilians killed as well. It didn't help the Zionist cause. But after the end of the war, it was clear that the Zionist paramilitary organizations wanted to force the British out because they saw what had happened as a result of the British control over Palestine during the critical period of the Holocaust. And so they increased the pressure on the British. There was open warfare cases between the British and the Jews. There was an attempt to bring in refugees, survivors of the Holocaust. The British would intercept the ships, take them back to Europe, or put them on and turn them on Cyprus. The famous Exodus story came out of that kind of experience. There were some Jews who were able to sneak in with the help of the Haganah and the other organizations. This was called Aliyah Bet, secondary immigration, which of course was not legal. And there were lots of cat and mouse games played during this period. But anyway, politically what happened was the British gave up. The empire was finished. They were exhausted after the war. They were bankrupt. And the Labour government had come in 1945 under Attlee with the notorious anti-Semitic foreign minister Bevin. It was Ernest Bevin. There were two Bevins in the government. I think this one was Ernest Bevin. And so they said, we're fed up. We're going to turn it over to the UN. You guys figure out what to do. So the UN then established a special committee on Palestine. I believe Canada was a member of that committee. And they came to Palestine. They interviewed Jews. They interviewed Arabs. Interviewed members of the mandatory government. And they went back to New York and decided to come up with a plan for Palestine. I think we're going to ignore these two maps labeled 1946 because these were not formal proposals. We'll go to the map labeled 1947. The UN Commission on Palestine had a majority report and a minority report. The majority report, I think Canada was part of that, recommended partition. So they resurrected the idea of partition, dividing mandatory Palestine between the Arabs and the Jews. This time they gave more territory to the Jews than had been proposed in 1937, and they divided Palestine into 6 parts. Each side got 3 parts which were connected at narrow junctions, one in the north and one in the center-south. And this was obviously a very unstable situation. I don't think that the partition plan, if it had been accepted, would have worked. It would have fallen apart because you can't have 2 states, each with 3 parts, which are connected only at narrow crossing points. this proposal went to the General Assembly. It's not clear legally why, because General Assembly doesn't have legal authority. But anyway, that was what was used. General Assembly requires 2/3 vote, and on 29th of November 1947, General Assembly did get more than 2/3 majority for accepting the partition plan. The Jews accepted it, and you've seen pictures of them dancing the hora in Tel Aviv, and generally, even though they were getting much less territory than they had originally hoped for, the calculation was this was the best we can do. The Arabs rejected the partition plan, and the next day, November 30th, fighting started between Arab irregulars in Palestine against Jewish communities and Jewish forces. And from the end of November 47 until independence on May 15, 48, there was continual fighting going on. It was a civil war between Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs. The Jewish paramilitary organizations, notably Haganah and Eitzel, versus whatever groups were organized by the Arabs. There were terrorist incidents that occurred. The Arabs claimed that there was a massacre of innocents at Deir Yassin by the Eitzel forces, which is an Arab village near Jerusalem. The Jews, well, the Irgun claimed that their forces were fired upon. They were returning fire. That's never been resolved, but it was perceived by the Arabs in Palestine as an indication that they were going to be killed if they didn't defend themselves against the Jews. And so many Arabs left areas that were in contention to get out of the way of the fighting and to avoid being what they considered to be victims of another massacre, such as Deir Yassin. There was a massacre of Jews coming down from Mount Scopus, from Hadassah Hospital into the main part of Jerusalem under a UN convoy because they had to pass through Arab territory, and there was a massacre at the bottom of Mount Scopus. So both sides were convinced that the other side was going to massacre them if they didn't defend themselves. During the early days of post-partition, the Arabs had the upper hand, but the Haganah got better organized and began an offensive in the spring of 48 and began to gain territory and was in a better military position by independence on May 15th. There was a debate within the Jewish leadership as to whether they should declare independence on May 15th, which was the date that the British announced they were leaving, and at midnight, Friday night of May 14th, the British governor sailed off out of Haifa, leaving no British forces behind. So the Zionist leadership had to decide, do we declare a state or do we try to work out another arrangement? And there was actually a contested vote in the executive of the Vaad Leumi. Ben-Gurion wanted a declaration of independence. Others were more cautious, but those in favor of independence won. And so on May 14th, 1948, which was Friday afternoon, Ben-Gurion convened the leadership of the Yishuv in Tel Aviv. And you've all seen pictures of this. There's a big picture of Herzl in the background and a bunch of politicians sitting at a table facing the audience, and he read out the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, which was obviously a momentous event. I urge you to read it. It's easily accessible, and it sets out the principles of the state. It's not a constitutionally binding document, but the Supreme Court has found constitutional value in it in the absence of a constitution, which Israel still does not have. Two books to recommend. One, if you're interested in the period post-World War I, during the peace conference, first of all, 3 books. If you want to read about the peace conference, Margaret Macmillan's 1919 is a very worthwhile book on that. Eminent historian. There's also a book called A Peace to End All Peace by a guy named David Fromkin, Fromkin, which really tells in great detail how the Ottoman Empire broke up and why different parts of it went in different directions. And then I think if you're interested in the history of Israel, the best book is by Anita Shapira. It's just written a few years ago. Israel, A History, very simple title. I had the privilege of serving on the jury for the first book prize awarded by the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies at Concordia, and we awarded the prize to that book by Anita Shapira. So I'm not going to go into historical details. And one more book to recommend, simply called 1948 by Benny
Morris.
Benny Morris, of course. Benny Morris, who's been in Montreal most recently last fall. Important historian in modern Israel. If you want to know what happened in 1948 from a pretty much objective historical view, Benny Morris is a Zionist, but he doesn't show favoritism toward the Zionists, in my opinion. If you want to know what happened in 48, 49, the War of Independence, read Benny Morris's book. And he deals with the origins of the refugee problem, which was a combination, due to a combination of Arabs leaving to get out of the way of the fighting, or to get out of the way of the Arab armies. They left because Palestinian Arab society collapsed due to the departure of the leadership, and based on the structure that they had, they didn't have a political structure like the Yishuv had. When the leadership pulled out, the society collapsed. There was no replacement leadership, and people went away in panic. Some people left because of fear of massacres. The rumors of the massacre of Deir Yassin spread like wildfire. A lot of people left because of that. And in some cases, the Israelis drove out local Arabs. There's no question that at Lida, which is now Lud, which is where the airport is, and at Ramla, which is nearby, in the early days of the state, the army came in and loaded the residents on trucks and shipped them out and deposited them on the other side of the lines, dividing Israel from the Arab fighters. Yitzhak Rabin himself was in command of one of the units that was responsible for carrying this out. So yes, there were some Arabs who were expelled, but they were only a portion of the Arabs who became refugees after 1948. And Benny Morris details this in his book. Okay, moving right along. Israel was grossly outnumbered by the military forces of the Arab states: Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, plus Palestinian irregulars. All were fighting against Israel after May 15th. And basically they were invading Palestine. All these different armies, except for the Palestinians who were there, were invading Palestine. The major forces were the Jordanian forces sent by King Abdullah, who refused entreaties by Golda Meir not to fight, presaging similar behavior by his grandson, King Hussein, in 1967. That's in the next lecture. So he invaded what came to be called the West Bank because he wanted to add it to his kingdom. He wasn't there primarily because he cared about the Palestinians. I don't think he cared about Palestinian Arabs at all. He wanted to enlarge his kingdom. There was a vacuum there. The British had pulled out. The Jews were not very numerous in the area adjacent to between the Jordan River and the Judean hills. And so he made a grab for territory and succeeded in that for the most part. Meanwhile, the Egyptians wanted to make gains in the south, and so they invaded in the south. So the Arab forces outnumbered the Jews. The Jews didn't have arms until after May 15th, when they were able to import arms. The British hadn't allowed them to import any arms before May 15th. But the Jewish forces, despite guys arriving on ships from DP camps and being shipped to the front a week later, were better organized and better prepared and better led than the Arab forces. And so the better quality of the Israeli army in its nascent stage in May 1948, in June and July, outweighed the numerical advantage of the Arabs. So yes, the Arabs had a numerical advantage, but the Israelis had a better army, and the army rapidly grew to be better in the first few months of the war. So much so that by June there was already a truce, which both sides used to bring in more arms, and Israelis brought in more troops as they could get refugees in. And in the next stage, which went up until around October, the Israelis definitely made advances. Then there was another truce, and then in the fall and the winter, the Israelis went on the offensive again, and in January 1949, an Israeli division led by Yigal Allon, who was then a general in the army, was deep in Sinai, heading toward the canal. At that point, the British put the screws, because they wanted to protect their clients in Cairo, put the screws on Ben Gurion, and Ben Gurion decided to withdraw the army back to the international border. The Egyptians who were left in Palestine were in this pocket along the strip, Gaza Strip. There was another pocket called Fallujah where they basically had to surrender. And if you look at the map of 1948-49, you can see the areas that Israel gained that had not been allocated to Israel by the partition plan. In particular, they gained control of all of the north. The north was no longer divided. Israel got eastern and western Galilee. They got the triangle. If you look at 48-49, the top tip of the West Bank is shaded darker. That's the triangle. Israel gained control of that. That's mainly Arabs living there, and it's a source of some difficulty. I was in the triangle in 2014. It's not a friendly place generally, although, well, we went to Nazareth, which is above the triangle, which is a friendlier place than the triangle. The triangle is very hostile toward Israel, but it's part of Israel, and they're citizens. And my guess is that the three members of Knesset who were suspended the other day probably have their roots in the triangle. Okay, then you see that Israel gained a lot of territory, widening the strip between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and giving Beersheba some elbow room away from Arab areas. And Israel gained all this territory along the international border with Egypt, leaving only the Gaza Strip in Egyptian hands. So that was the end of the war. The Arabs refused to make a peace treaty, or any peace treaties, since there were several belligerent states. The best that could be done was that UN negotiated armistice agreements where actually Israelis and Arabs sat across from each other, but they were four separate armistice agreements: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And an armistice is not a peace treaty, but it is a cessation of hostilities. And so any fighting after the armistice agreements was, in my judgment, illegal under international law. And speaking of international law, getting back to what we said earlier, international law was what was written into the mandate. That was international law, that Palestine was to be a national home for the Jewish people. In any event, there are some revisionist historians, of whom Benny Morris used to be one, who have written views of that period which differ from the standard Zionist views. There were three revisionist historians. With Benny Morris, I recommend that you read his last work, which was 1948, rather than the earlier works, which were about the Palestinian refugee problem. 1948 is much more comprehensive and up-to-date representation of his thinking, and I think that as a result of that, I would no longer classify him among the revisionist historians who were taking a anti or non-Zionist narrative position. He has reaffirmed his Zionist identity since writing the 1948 book, and I've heard him say so in person when he's been here in Montreal giving talks. The other two are Ilan Pappé, whom I regard as totally discredited as a scholar. He eventually left the University of Haifa. Among other things, he left behind a student who had written basically a fraudulent MA thesis. And Ilan Pappé is clearly anti-Zionist. The third is Avi Schleim, who is at Oxford, has some credibility. He wrote about collusion across the Jordan between King Abdullah and the Israelis, but I think he's also anti-Zionist. All three of these guys obviously are or were Israelis, but as we know, there are Israelis who've taken anti-Zionist positions. Okay, we're really going to fly through the next few years to get up to 1967. Once the war was over, it was clear that the Arab world was hostile. Ben Gurion and the Mapai Party, which dominated the government until 1977, from 1930 till 1977, Mapai was the dominant political party in the Yishuv and then in Israel. They built up the institutions of the state while pursuing a policy that Ben Gurion called mamlachtiyut, which really means state building. It's very hard to translate it, but this was the cornerstone of his domestic policy. He wanted to build a strong state, and Israel became a strong state. It's a technical term in political science literature. It really means a state where power is concentrated in the central authority. And as you know, Israel is a unitary state. There are no provinces or states that are part of it. Municipal government doesn't have much authority, and state institutions are important, whether they're economic or military or security. They have to be strong in order to make the state work. In 1950, they passed the law of return, which meant that any Jew could immigrate to Israel. They didn't resolve the question of who is defined as a Jew by it. Just said any Jew can immigrate to Israel. Jewish Agency was established with a different purpose than the old Jewish Agency in pre-state period. New Jewish Agency focused on immigration and absorption of immigrants. Israel more than doubled its size in the first 3 years because of immigration. The immigration pre-48 had largely been in the various aliyot. There were 5 aliyot. European, Ashkenazim. After 48, the primary source of immigrants besides the survivors of the Holocaust were Middle Eastern states, the Mizrahim, or as they were then called, Sfaradim. And they came in large numbers because they were kicked out of the Arab states, basically, and because they just found life in the Arab states to be untenable. Some came to the west, including to Montreal, but the Sfaradim who came to Montreal largely came in the 50s, mid to late 50s, when Morocco cracked down on the Jewish community. But the Iraqi Jews, the Egyptian Jews, the Yemenites, Jews from southern part of Yemen, like Aden, all came in large numbers in 48, 49, and had a profound effect on society. 56, there was another war. The Arab world was committed to destroying Israel. The Egyptians concluded a big arms deal with the Russians in 55. Strategically, Israel thought that this looked ominous. Israel did not have an American connection yet. The Americans were not supplying arms to Israel. The main source of arms in 48, 49 was Czechoslovakia with the blessings of the Soviet Union. After that, it was France. There was very close collaboration with France throughout the 50s into the 60s, which led to the arming of the Israeli army in the 50s and to the beginning of the Israeli nuclear project in the 60s, which was engineered by Shimon Peres, who was Ben-Gurion's right-hand man in running the defense ministry. He was longtime deputy defense minister, even though he did not have a military background. In any event, the Egyptian armament in 1955-56 led the Israelis to think that they might have to preempt before Egypt could start a war. The British and French, who were booted out of Suez by Nasser, gave them an excuse. They got together with the British and French, launched an attack on Egypt. Late October 1956 really ticked off Eisenhower because he wasn't aware of it. He was president at the time, and he was 1 week before Election Day when he was re-elected president. He came down hard on the British and French, who abandoned the project pretty quickly. Meanwhile, the Israeli army had successfully captured all of Sinai up to the canal, sat there when ceasefire was achieved, but in February of 1957, Ike put the screws on the Israeli government. Among other things, threatened to revoke the charitable status of Jewish organizations that funneled money to Israel, which would have been a very serious blow at that time. American money from the Jewish community flowing to Israel was vital during that period. Ben-Gurion backed down in exchange for guarantees that there would be free transit through the Straits of Tiran, which you can see on any of these maps. If you look at the map of 1967, Straits of Tiran is right on there. It's where Aqaba, where the Gulf of Aqaba opens to the Red Sea, and where ships from Eilat, the southern port, could go through and on their way to the east, to the Orient, because Egypt would not allow Israeli shipping through the Suez Canal. So there's no other way the only other way to get to the east was to go through the Mediterranean, down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. So it was vital for Israeli commerce to be able to go through the Straits of Tiran. So the shipping was guaranteed through the free shipping passage through the Straits of Tiran, and a UN force was installed in the Sinai Peninsula, which was kept demilitarized. No Egyptian army in Sinai, and Israel, of course, withdrew to the international border. In 1967, egged on by the Soviets and their clients, the Syrians, Nasser did two things. One is he asked that UNEF, the UN force in Sinai, be removed. Utant, the Secretary General of the UN, immediately complied. The Egyptian army then moved into Sinai and moved right up to the international border, creating a threat there. And in addition, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and with Egyptians in Sharm el-Sheikh, they were able to effectively control passage through the Straits of Tiran. That precipitated the Six-Day War. The Western powers neglected or failed to uphold their undertakings to Israel after 56. And Israel said, okay, if you're not going to do what you promised to do, we're going to act. Hence, Israel initiated the Six-Day War. That's really not the right word. I think Nasser initiated the Six-Day War, and Israel started the hostilities by attacking the Egyptian Air Force on June 5th, 67. While the pilots were eating breakfast, the Egyptian Air Force was wiped out on the ground, and that determined the outcome of the war, which is still astonishing. In 6 days, Israel plowed through Sinai, defeated the Egyptian army in 2 days, roughly, and then Nasser egged on King Hussein of Jordan to join in the before the Israeli victory was clear, to join in this glorious defeat of Israel, which was underway. So Hussein ordered the Arab Legion to attack on the West Bank. They crossed the they were already in the West Bank because they controlled it, but they started fighting in Jerusalem, and the Israeli army retaliated, fought back, liberated the eastern part of Jerusalem, and drove the Arab Legion army out of the West Bank entirely back over the Jordan River. Hence, Israel gained control of the West Bank, and then they tackled the Golan Heights and defeated Syria there. I guess that's really supposed to be in the next unit, so I'll just mention a few other things. During the 50s, foreign policy was friendly to the West. Soviets had thought that with the left-wing government and with the second leading party being Mapam, which was in 1949, which was oriented toward Moscow, that Israel might be an ally. It turned out not to be. It was oriented toward the West. And so they stopped supplying arms to Israel. Israel found a partner with France. And it was only after 67 when de Gaulle announced in a press conference that he was not going to supply any more arms to use some very nasty term, an adjective to describe the Israelis, that the Israelis turned to the Americans, who have been their source of arms ever since. So foreign policy was oriented toward the West, but Israel failed to establish the kind of relationship with the U.S. that it had hoped to until after 67. In the meantime, internally, Israel had given up on the idea of adopting a constitution, which it had promised to do in 1948. If you read the Declaration of Independence, it says that we're going to have elections for a constituent assembly, which is going to adopt the Constitution by October 1st, 1948. They still haven't adopted a constitution. Instead, in the 50s, they started to adopt individual basic laws which cover different parts of the government. These basic laws have been adopted over a period of many years, one at a time, sometimes two at a time. There are about a dozen of them in force now, but they haven't finished yet, so there's still no constitution. Immigration has ebbed and flowed, but there was a big immigration of the Russians in the 1990s, and the population, which was 600,000 in 1948, is now 8.25 million. Well, there were 600,000 Jews, I guess. Or was it 600,000 Jews and Arabs? In any event, there were about 600,000 people in Israel in 1948. They're now 8.25 million, which is roughly the size of Quebec, to give you an idea of the comparative populations. Obviously, the area is much smaller, but the population is the same. The economy has been transformed from a socialist economy that probably would have made Bernie Sanders proud, which is one of the reasons he went to a Marxist kibbutz for a few months as a young man. It's a very free market economy now, and is definitely capitalist oriented. That didn't change before 67. It changed after 1977, which is not within my purview today. So, summarizing the period 1967, which took me more than an hour to cover. The state was built, the state was established, and then the state created the institutions of statehood, which centralized power in the government, and they developed a competitive political system, very democratic party and electoral system, but in my judgment, a terrible electoral system, because I think that proportional representation is a very bad idea, and I don't know why Canada is now considering it. I think it would be a bad mistake for Canada. So, talking off topic, I urge you to oppose the Liberal Party plan to consider proportional representation here. It's been very bad for Israel. So, I guess that will sum things up, and we still have 15 minutes left for questions, so I'm open to questions from you. Yes.
You mentioned that you were talking about the international law and the legal foundation for the establishment of a Jewish state. Forget the different treaties you mentioned. But is there, would those same international treaties be as well the foundation for an Arab state?
No.
In what is Palestine?
No.
What was Palestine?
No.
No?
Because all these treaties were based on the Balfour Declaration. And remember the first thing I said at the beginning, the Balfour Declaration talked about the civil and religious rights of other communities in Palestine, but not national rights. So the treaties were not about building an Arab state in Palestine. Palestine was to be a Jewish state.
What about
Jewish
the partition plans?
Well, the partition plan, the first partition appeal was not accepted. It was rejected by the Arabs. The second partition plan in 1947 was rejected by the Arabs. So they had their chance to set up Arab states in Palestine, and they didn't.
But partition plans, you don't see that as having any international legal credibility. It's just a plan. It's a plan that was proposed and rejected.
Yeah, the partition plans are dead. You can't go back to the partition plans. They're dead. There was an opportunity to accept them in 1948, 47, 48, and the Arabs declined. And that's why they were given a Palestinian state in 1947. They didn't establish it. The reason they didn't establish it was because they hadn't developed politically during the Mandate period the way the Jews had developed politically. I didn't talk about what went on in Arab Palestine during the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, but they didn't build political institutions. They had what they call the Arab High Committee. Well, who was the Arab High Committee? It was the big landowners and the traditional wealthy leadership, but they had no contact with the rank and file, and they weren't interested in democracy. They weren't interested in the state. They were interested in preserving what they had. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think the implications would be of Israel completing and establishing a constitution, and whether, why might it have not been in their best interest to do so before this point? I'm just wondering why it's sort of an ongoing project that doesn't seem to be
The reason
getting any emphasis.
they couldn't establish a constitution is because they couldn't agree on all the provisions that have to be in a constitution. In particular, Ben-Gurion could never be confident that he could get the religious parties to agree to a constitution. Because if you put freedom of religion into the constitution, what does that do to the monopoly of the Orthodox in Israeli public life? And so there is no basic law governing religion yet, freedom of religion. And there were other issues that were controversial. So it became evident very early on, but it was mainly because religious parties were worried that the Constitution would some way interfere with their ability to run religious affairs. And so they they balked, and Ben Gurion understood that he wasn't going to impose a constitution on them. And I'm not sure that he was entirely enamored with the idea of a constitution. And Anita Shapira talks about this in her book. He had some reservations about it. But in any event, there never was agreement. And so they decided instead to enact these basic laws one at a time. The first one was about the Knesset around 1957. In the back of the book here we have a list of the basic laws. Yeah, here it is. 1958, Knesset. Then the next one was Israel Lands, 1960. The President, 1964. The economy. They didn't even adopt one. Well, the government, I think there were earlier laws on the government. They were repealed. The current law on the government was only adopted in 2001. And in 2014, there is a referendum law about relinquishing territory being approved by a national referendum. There are some basic laws about rights and liberties, but they're limited. They're not nearly as broad as the Canadian Charter or the U.S. Bill of Rights. There are also questions about what does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state? What is the place of Arab citizens in the state? Now, the Declaration of Independence promises equality to all citizens. What would happen today if that issue came up? How would the state define itself? And as you know, last year the government was considering a proposal for a basic law declaring Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. But it got a lot of opposition because there are controversial aspects of it. So it was never voted on. It was pulled by the government. Another question.
Do you feel this theme since the early history, and I gather even before 1917, there is continuous political theme on the Arab side, and this is rejectionism. Whatever was put on the table was denied. And so this is on the Arab side. The Zionists always say, whether it's Balfour Declaration or San Remo or the Peel or whatever was on the table, and even all the way to 2000 when Barak said, he's given Arafat 97%, 96%
of the West Bank.
Of the West Bank. So the question to you, what do you feel about this Arab rejectionism, or what do you think about the Jewish approach, almost groveling over 100 years, facing continuous and unrelenting Arab rejectionism? Is it a historical mistake? This is a question that always comes to mind.
Yeah.
Didn't we learn from our experience? Didn't the Jewish state learn from its experience that maybe we should have rejected at one point the whole idea of Arab state besides the Jewish state, because they never came to the table. And today it comes to haunt us because France says, and then Italy, if you don't decide, we decide on a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
But nobody comes to the table. In my opinion, I'd like to hear your opinion, it was a great Zionist mistake to realize that we can ever come to terms. Aren't we better at taking all this population, and it'll be better for the population, move them on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley.
Transfer?
Well, you call it transfer. I call it population exchange. Whatever you call it, transfer is I don't want to get to the connotation and the historical term transfer. It's hard. But if you take a look, and let's call it a transfer for now, isn't the transfer better to the Arabs, better to the Gazan, better to the people? I mean, they live in an open in an open political asylum. Wouldn't it better take the Gazan people and put them in Jordan and give them housing and schooling and all together? It ain't working. So forget about the words.
Yeah, that's a question that requires a very long answer to do justice to the question. It's a very important question. So I'll give a short answer. The Jews were weak, politically and certainly militarily, and were in no position in 1900 or 1917 or 1929 to tell anyone what to do. And that's why they had to operate on the sufferance of the great powers. I mean, why did Weizmann go to the British cabinet in 1917 to get the Balfour Declaration? Because the Jews were not in a position to establish a Jewish national home or a Jewish state on their own. And the Jews were badly divided. I mean, look what was the situation in Russia at the time the Zionist movement emerged. There were lots of Russian Jews who wanted to get out of Russia. It was terrible in the 1880s and 1890s. Where did they mainly go? They came to North America. They didn't go to Palestine. And there were other Russian Jews who said, Russia is where we live. We want autonomy as Jews, but in Russia. So we're going to stay here. The Bund, for example. So the Zionists, although they gained popularity quickly, were not necessarily the majority of the Jewish people. And I'm not sure that a majority of the Jewish people became Zionists until after '67. In the 1880s, the Reform movement in America was saying that we are not a nation, we are not a people, we are only a religion. And what were the German Jews saying? We are Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. So this was not an atmosphere where the Jews were capable of self-determination on any piece of land. And that's why they lined up with the other nations at the Paris Peace Conference, and it was a great step forward for the Zionist cause that they were recognized and given the beginnings of a Jewish national home. They get to, they set up the mandate, and then, I read you the population figures. They were, a tenth of the population of Palestine? So who were they going to order around? They needed the British to protect them from the Arabs. So the Jews were not in a position to tell anybody what to do. They were not in a position to assert their will, their national will, unilaterally. It was impossible. And in the 1930s, when some Jews understood what was happening in Europe and the absolute necessity of getting Jews into Palestine, what could they do? They weren't in a position to open the gates of Palestine. They tried to get Jews out. I told you that Jabotinsky was going around warning people of dangers. They didn't listen to him. So the Jews were not in a position to exercise self-determination then. And what were they offered in '37? A really crummy proposal, which in their desperation, some of the leadership considered. So it was only when they achieved greater numbers and they achieved the confidence of exercising self-determination, and they felt that this was their only chance historically, that if you don't take the chance in '48, you miss the third Commonwealth. And that's why some Zionist leaders were opposed to declaring independence in May 1948. So the opportunity was not there. The Jews were weak. And that's why part of the Israeli political culture is strength, that we have to be stronger than everybody else in the neighborhood in order to maintain our independence. Our independence is constantly threatened. But now, is Israel in a position to say, okay, we're going to keep what's called the West Bank against, if there's really strong international pressure? A friend of mine, he's now deceased, but he was a colleague and we worked closely together for many years, made Aliyah back in the 1970s. And he said...
Professor Ostrich?
What?
Professor Ostrich?
No.
No?
He said that diaspora Jewry has missed a big chance after 1967. If diaspora Jews would have moved in the hundreds of thousands and settled the areas of the West Bank, then the demography would have been different. But that didn't happen. Now, I'm not saying that would have been a good idea or a bad idea, but that's what he said. And, there are Jews living in parts of what is called the West Bank, which is a problematic name. And it's understood in Israel that the settlement blocks, such as Gush Etzion and Ariel and Ma'ale Adumim, will be incorporated into Israel in any peace settlement. The problem is there's no peace settlement on the horizon. But what about the farther out settlements? Are they tenable? If there's going to be a Palestinian state, which is not on the horizon, and take a look at Tom Friedman's article in today's New York Times, if there is going to be a Palestinian state, those settlements are not going to be viable. Now, some of those guys are very brave, and they say, we're going to stay, we'd rather live here under Palestinian rule than live in Tel Aviv under Israeli rule. But the question I would put to them is, what's more important to you? Do you want to live in Medinat Yisrael, or do you want to live in Eretz Yisrael? You may not be able to live in both simultaneously. I don't think that those small, what I would call ideological settlements are viable, and certainly not if they become part of a Palestinian state. So there's weakness there. Israel is not capable of imposing its will on the whole area, and that's been the problem for Israel all along. So Israel has had to be pragmatic, and I think it has basically had pragmatic leadership going back to the pre-state period. And Ben-Gurion, is rightfully the founder of his country because he understood what could be done and what couldn't be done. In 1949, he understood that even though the army could drive all the way to the Suez Canal, this was not going to be good for Israel. So that's the short answer. Summarizing it, I don't think the Jews were in a position at any point in history to do what you suggest they should have done.
Along the timeline,
Yeah.
time axis, we became from a nation scattered among going, basically a stardust with no cohesion. And I understand your argument about the early ages. My family, paternal party side came in after World War I. My maternal family came to Israel just as Hitler took power in 1934. So I understand very well the weakness. Israel was a physical weakling, but today it's a Goliath. I'm saying something had to change in the mind space, in the understanding that you're powerful now and you learn the lessons of history. I don't want to go into my own thinking, which is, I grew up among Palestinian and Arabs. I know them very well. My father was Arab speaking. We were very involved with the Arabs. But to leave this, I'm just saying right now I'm looking at the outcome of the political forces, and I still see the weak Jew. And somehow your argument, or the argument of the left that we're not strong enough, it's kind of a self-inflicting, we're powerful, we can do things. And I personally do not believe in the existence of the world. There's nothing to persuade me that there's a world and there's a worldview and that there's political power to make a decision that's unified and everybody agrees. I think it's a notion of the left, that there's the world and the world decides for us.
Your family was revisionist, right?
No, on my father's side they were communists,
Oh.
and on my mother's side they were Haskalah. They were.
Yeah, but, how do they orient within the Israeli political
Oh, I'm
system?
different from my family. My family were very, very left wing. I
Okay.
was born and grew up in a kibbutz.
All right, but if you were voting in an election in Israel, who would you vote for? What party?
I will probably vote for Naftali Bennett or to Moshe Feiglin or even to the Likud. I mean, I'm married into a Likud party.
Okay.
I changed. I started with the left, very, very,
Okay,
very
but
deep.
that perspective is not a majority perspective in Israel. I mean, how you know, Bayit Yehudi and Likud together got I don't know 41 seats. That's a third of the Knesset. So that's not where Israeli opinion is. Now, you may lament the fact that there are lots of Israelis who, in your view, are weak-kneed or weak-minded, but it's a democracy, and so there's not adequate